This is Dominic of the Dominomicon with a follow-up to my 5 fabulous skill actions video chapter. This time around, I've picked 2 basic actions and 4 skill actions to go over to help both GMs and players notice and use more of these interesting tactical actions in combat. If you haven't checked out my first video, it'll be the first link in the description, and it'll be easier to understand this video chapter if you've already seen that one. Every action I mention in this video chapter is available to all classes, so there's no excuse to not use and abuse them. If you find this video helpful or entertaining, please give it a like, comment, etc., and consider subscribing for more videos similar to this one. Without further ado, let's jump in. Let's start with the more simple basic actions before we move on to the skill actions. So basic action number 1, step. Step is a single action with the movement trait that only requires that your speed is 10 feet and you cannot step into difficult terrain. How it works is you just literally move 5 feet without triggering reactions, and there's feats you can take to increase the distance. Super simple and yet super underused by marshals. And why is that? Well, for non-marshals, spellcasters more specifically, step is great as casting a spell in melee range of an enemy with reactive strike gives them a chance to give you a wallop, so long as the spell has the manipulate trait, and lots of spells do. And if they crit on that, which they have a good chance of doing as most spellcasters have pants AC, the spell gets disrupted and you lose the action. And that's kind of a big deal. So spellcasters will step out of the way to avoid triggering that reaction with their spell and their movement, then cast away. And of course, if you need to close the gap for an ability's range, whether to assist an ally or do something to an enemy, or if you just need to move to flank, stepping instead of striding is always a good shout just in case the enemy has reactive strike. But it seems counterintuitive for a martial class, especially a melee one, to spend one of their precious actions stepping out of an enemy's reach, because that might mean spending another action on your subsequent turn getting into range of the enemy once again. And if they've already closed that gap on that turn, then they basically just lost one action, but you lost one action yourself. So that kind of makes it equal. So how is this worth it at all? Well, there's actually quite a few reasons for this. First of all, if we assume a situation where you're stood next to an enemy and can strike them 3 times, the chances of you actually hitting them with that third strike is incredibly low due to the MAP or multiple attack penalty. You're basically not going to hit if you roll anything less than a nat 17, so straight away it might be worth spending one action to do something other than an extra, mostly pointless attack attempt. And while there's plenty you can do, there are specific situations where stepping might be one of the best things you could possibly do. I mentioned it in my previous skill action video, but some enemies have a rather powerful 3-action combo they can do on you. The Ogre Glutton, for example, for one action has to attack you with its jaws, then for a second action can grab you, and then for its third it'll do its ultimate ability. But if they have to move to get to you because you spent one of your actions moving away, then you've just stopped them from doing that ultimate ability without even needing any sort of check. So long as you're aware of this enemy's ability, this gives you an almost guaranteed way of shutting down the most powerful action, potentially altering the encounter in a huge way. Also, in the case of fighting very strong singular enemies such as boss encounters, one of their actions being lost is a massive disadvantage versus you losing one of yours, because as mentioned in my previous skill actions video, your group overall might have 12 actions and they might only have 3. So spending one of your group's potential 12 actions to reduce their 3 actions by 1 is a big win. I think it also goes without saying that if you could step into a more advantageous position, such as being behind cover before an enemy does one of their powerful spells or something like that, then you can see that step has quite a lot of use cases for why it's actually a pretty good basic action. And that step, super simple, yet can be extremely effective when used at the right time against the right enemy. Okay, basic action number 2. Take cover. Take cover is a 1-action ability that only requires that you have something to take cover behind, usually down to GM discretion. If I told you that for 1 action, without a shield, you could increase your AC and reflex saving throw by 2, you would probably assume this was something as powerful as a base class ability. But no. Take cover is really that powerful when used at the right time, and if you're clever with positioning, that +2 can even go up to a +4, which is utterly insane in PF2E. So how cover works in PF2E is relatively simple. If you are, say, stood behind an ally, then you would probably get lesser cover, which is +1 to your AC. If you're behind a boulder that goes up to your waist, that would probably be standard cover, which is +2 to AC and to reflex saves. And if you're positioned right up against a wall with it directly between you and an enemy, you'll likely gain greater cover, which is a +4 to AC and reflex saves. So when you're in any sort of cover, you can use the take cover basic action to increase the level of cover by 1. So lesser cover becomes standard, and standard becomes greater. And while take cover can be extremely useful, it's entirely dependent on positioning. You can only get these bonuses to AC and reflex saves if you're in the correct position when you decide to take cover. Sometimes though, you could just simply drop prone for a single action and then take cover for another action to gain the +2 circumstance bonus, and while 2 actions is rather costly, in certain situations it could definitely be worth it. For example, if you're aware that the enemy you're facing has a rather high AC and you're suffering from the multiple attack penalty and you're near a wall or next to cover, etc. that's between you and said enemy, it might be worth spending that one action to gain that bonus to your AC and reflex saves. Or if you're aware that the enemy spellcaster is going to fling another fireball spell your way and you're not going to reach them in time, it might be worth spending an action or two to gain that reflex save bonus. Realistically though, in most cases, spellcasters and ranged marshals are the ones who are going to benefit from take cover the most. Casting a spell or shooting 2 ranged projectiles and then spending an action to take cover is pretty fantastic when you actually think about it, as it's kind of similar to raising a shield without needing to have one on hand. And considering that bonus could actually go up to a +4, it's potentially a tower shield. To top that off, if you want to sneak around or even make your enemies off guard to you, being in standard cover gives you a +2 to your stealth check, and greater cover gives you a +4, which could be very significant. So while take cover is very situational, it could make a huge difference if used correctly. Right, time to move on to the skill actions I've chosen for this video chapter, with skill action number 1. Disarm. Disarm is a trained athletics single action skill that targets reflex DC and requires a hand free or a weapon with the disarm trait, and that the enemy isn't more than one size larger than you. This skill action actually got buffed in the remaster. It works like this: you attempt to knock something out of a creature's grasp like a weapon. If you get a critical success, you successfully do just that, and the weapon or item falls to the ground in the target space. Realistically, a critical success is going to be the best case scenario and is generally not actually going to happen, at least initially. The benefits of knocking a weapon out of a creature's grasp are extremely obvious, especially if you nab that weapon from them with an interact action afterwards. But what happens on a normal success? What happens is that you weaken the enemy's grip on that particular item. This means that anyone who attempts to disarm further gets a +2 circumstance bonus to the check, and the target will take up -2 circumstance penalty to attack rolls with that particular item, unless they spend an action that has the manipulate trait to fix their grip on the item. And this lasts basically in perpetuity, which is an understated huge benefit to disarm, as some skill actions have very limited durations. Still, that interact action that they're going to have to do to fix the grip on that particular weapon will trigger reactive strikes for those that have that ability. So in some ways, this is quite similar to tripping an enemy in that they have to spend an action to fix it, otherwise they take a pretty chunky penalty to their attack rolls and they have to spend that action to fix it, which will trigger a reactive strike. A big plus side of this particular skill action is that it's going to help your allies or even yourself on your next turn actually disarm the enemy. And as I've already mentioned, having an enemy lose their weapon could be potentially encounter changing, especially if it's a powerful creature like a boss. But as I mentioned in my first skill actions video, there's nothing stopping you from applying 2 penalties to an enemy through skill actions at the same time. So if you demoralize an enemy first and then try to disarm them, you're increasing your chance of them actually getting fully disarmed with a critical success, especially if you attempt this again on your second turn, because they already have a -2 to that check. So with the demoralized, that becomes a -3, which hugely increases your chances of actually disarming them. Then you simply need to use an interact action to grab that weapon and giggle at your mostly helpless enemy, all while your GM notes down to kill your character ASAP. That's what I do as a GM anyway. So yeah, disarm is pretty cool, but let's move on to the next skill action. Number 2, shove. Shove is an untrained athletics single action skill that targets fortitude DC and requires a free hand or a weapon with the shove trait, and that the enemy isn't more than one size larger than you. Shove, like some of the other skill actions I've mentioned, is deceptively simple. On a critical success, you move the target 10 feet away from you and you can stride after it so long as you cover the same distance. And on a success, that 10 feet becomes 5 feet. I also love that on a critical failure, you lose your balance, fall, and land prone, which is just hilarious. Going from, "Raw, I'm gonna push you around," to, "Oopsie doodle, I fell on my bum," is just freaking hilarious to me. So, the first question you're probably gonna ask is, why would I want to push someone 5 feet? The obvious answer is, if it's a cliff edge, then it's a really good tactical maneuver. However, the enemy does get a reaction called grab an edge to stop themselves actually falling off the cliff. So realistically, there's a good chance that they're not actually going to fall, even if you do get a successful shove. A critical success on a shove, however, would probably increase that chance significantly because they're not really going to be able to grab an edge when they're 10 feet away from it. And they also need to have a hand free to grab onto that edge, so if they're using a two-handed weapon, well, it's gone now. But the more realistic and common scenario is that you're going to want to push the enemy away from an ally. This is probably going to be more useful for your spellcaster allies than it is going to be for anyone else. Let's say that one of your allies is planning to do a 3-action spell on the next turn, but this particular enemy has reactive strike and they are stood in melee range of your ally. There's basically nothing you could do at that point to stop them from getting that reactive strike off unless you shove them away from your ally. And the fact that you get to stride along with them means that you don't have to spend an extra action actually getting into melee range with them again. And do bear in mind that this is force movement, which means that it doesn't trigger reactions, so you're not going to get a reactive strike for an ally shoving an enemy, unfortunately. Also consider that maybe your ally is doing a 3-action heal and you want to knock the enemy just outside of the radius, but you yourself stay in the radius and actually gain the benefits of that heal. But there's a lot of other good uses for shove, like shoving an enemy out of the way in a tight corridor so your ally can get in there with you, or knocking an enemy into a trap or area of effect, or pushing an enemy away from you so they can't do their ultimate ability on you, etc. Remember that you don't have to move with the enemy if you don't want to. It's definitely a more niche skill action, but it does have some very interesting uses, and it's one of those skill actions that you should always just keep in your mind for certain scenarios, especially if the cliff situation does actually come up, because it's just so much fun to push people off cliffs. I mean in the game, not in real life. People get weirdly upset when you push them off cliffs in real life. Similar to shove is reposition that was added in the remaster. It works in almost the exact same way, but you don't always have to push an enemy away from you, and you can instead move them to the side of you or behind you. So long as you keep the enemy in your reach, then you're good. Not sure why you'd want to move an enemy behind you, but hey, you do you. Alright, on to skill action number 3, Feint. Feint is a trained deception single action skill that targets perception DC and requires that you're within melee range of your target. I did briefly mention Feint in my previous skill actions video. Feint is basically a melee version of create a diversion, except that there's no penalty for using it over and over, and there's a critical success effect also. On said critical success, the enemy is off guard to your melee attacks until the end of your next turn. This is pretty awesome. No need to flank, no need to risk triggering reactive strikes to get into the right position, no messing around, just one action and they're off guard for a pretty long time. It's going to be at least one whole turn of them being off guard to you before it wears off, and because there's no penalty for doing it over and over, you can just do it again next time. And taking MAP into consideration, you probably aren't going to want to attack more than twice anyway, so feinting before that precious first attack that has your highest bonus means that you're increasing the chances of critting right from the get-go. As for the other action you have left over, remember, combine conditions. Demoralizing the enemy and then feinting means that they effectively get a -3 to their AC. Bashing them with your first attack with such a huge bonus to your attack roll is pretty huge. Plus, with that demoralize first, you're lowering their perception DC also, giving you a small chance of actually getting that critical success on your feint in the first place. As for a normal success for feint, they're only off guard to your next melee attack before the end of your current turn, which is still pretty good, and still means you can demoralize first if you wanted to. And bear in mind that deception is a charisma-based skill, so you don't necessarily have to be a strength-based character to get off that debuff. And as I said with create a diversion, if you've pumped some points into your charisma, then grabbing intimidation is pretty easy, meaning that you have a good chance of being able to do those double condition combos. Another thing to keep in mind, unlike doing something like grappling an enemy to make them off guard, feint doesn't have the attack trait, meaning that it doesn't suffer from the MAP. So this ends up being one of those skills that, in a pinch, when maybe your allies aren't around, allows you to get an enemy off guard without having to take a penalty to your next attack roll, pretty consistently, over and over, basically as often as you like. It's one of those conditions that can just be done repeatedly, consistently irritating your GM, which I'm sure we all love to do. There's never any downside to annoying your GM, nothing could possibly go wrong. Okay, on to the final skill action, though this particular one requires you to take it as a skill feat, which you could potentially get as low as level 1 with certain choices, but otherwise can easily take at level 2. The fourth and final skill action for this video chapter is Bon Mo. Apparently that's the correct pronunciation. It's not Bon Mot, it's Bon Mo. Bon Mo is a trained diplomacy skill feat single action skill that targets will DC and has the auditory, concentrate, emotion, linguistic, and mental traits. So yeah, a lot of traits. This skill action is your character basically making a witty statement towards an enemy, whether that being an insult, something to distract them, or something similar. On a critical success, the target takes a -3 status penalty to perception and, more importantly, will saves for a whole minute. And even on a success, they're stuck with a -2 penalty to those stats instead of a -3, but it still lasts for that whole minute. For real, this skill action is a spellcaster's extremely close friend, to the point where everyone thinks there's something going on between them. I think it's the way they look at each other. other, you can tell that those looks go beyond just like close friends, and if you've ever seen them talk to each other when they think no one's around. Oh wait, what was I doing? Oh yeah, so it's pretty difficult to lower saves in PF2E generally without the use of spells. Spellcasters that use any mind-altering spells, which can be a lot of occult-based casters, probably more so than the others, though Arcane is up there also, will love you if you successfully get this debuff on an enemy, as that -2 or 3 to will saves is extremely powerful and highly increases the chances of their spells going off. To top that off, due to it lasting a whole minute, this means that a spellcaster can try again and again to pop off more and more spells, really messing up a bad guy. Again, this skill action is fantastic against powerful boss encounters. And the penalty to perception checks is also pretty amazing for your ranged allies that are trying to create a diversion on an enemy, increasing their chances of making their enemy off guard to them, as the DC for create a diversion goes up and up as you use it. A successful Bon Mo might be enough to have a ranged ally have a second stab at getting an enemy off guard again. It's also one of those extremely flavorful things that you can tailor to your character for each and every use if you want to do that. There's a million ways in which your player character can Bon Mo an enemy, and with each enemy being different, there's a crazy high potential for lots of variety and maybe even lots of humor too. Having a tiny sprite make a giant ogre feel bad about their smelly feet or something to the point where it upsets them or distracts them so much that they crit fail a will save is one of those moments that you won't soon forget. Sadly, Demoralize doesn't stack with Bon Mo as they're both status penalties, but you could still Demoralize first to make it easier to get that Bon Mo off, as the frightened effect that comes from Demoralized lowers all checks and DCs, including the enemy's will DC. And as Demoralized lowers at the end of an enemy's turn and Bon Mo can last a whole minute, it's technically a better skill action to use than Demoralize overall for helping out spellcasters, at least those that target will saves. There's two downsides to Bon Mo, however. The first is that, as already mentioned, you need to get a skill feat to be able to grab this, and it requires training in diplomacy in order to do that. No biggie, but the second downside is a bit bigger. The enemy can, for one action, retort to your Bon Mo, and if they roll high enough, they lose that pretty decent debuff. Still, it would be pretty funny to hear that ogre try to come up with an excuse for his smelly feet, but rolling poorly due to his crappy charisma and him just making things seem worse for his fungal problem.
It's a medical condition, I'm telling you.
Yeah, sure. Alright, I think I've been over the more complex basic actions and the majority of skill actions in PF2E. And while there are still a few more I could go over, I feel as though some of what I could say is either too basic or kind of redundant. Still, if you think I should do another video chapter on some other basic actions like aid, delay, ready, etc., so I could tell you some cool tactics or strategies on using them, let me know in the comments below. And speaking of comments, I'd like to ask you a question, my beautiful and loyal viewers. What's your favorite skill or basic action? And do you have a fun story of when you used one of them to hilarious or amazing effect? I love hearing stories about kick-ass uses of actions in PF2E, so please leave a comment and share. As ever, if you enjoyed this video chapter or found it helpful, please give it a like and consider subscribing. Your kind words really mean a lot to me. For real, they really do. But that's it for this video chapter. This is Dominic of the Domini Mininomicon, wishing you a fond farewell, and until next time, goodbye.